everybody, if you could take your seats, please. We're about to begin. I'm Sivan Hong. I'm a member of the trustees of the library board. Welcome, welcome. Just a reminder, please wear your mask unless you're eating or drinking. And for the little food things that we have on the seats, feel free to take them home with you. Also, we have index cards on the tables for the question and answer session at around 11 o'clock. We'll be picking those up. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them down there. All right. Strange talking in a microphone with my mask on, but I will do my best. Welcome to our first exchange, Conversations about the Ideas of Our Time. Our concept for the exchange is to have speakers who have made or are making a significant positive change that addresses a pressing social challenge. When I learned about who'd be speaking today, the fangirl in me was super excited. After all, we have watched 5 years ago to the day this story break. I had conversations with my friends and my husband, who's sitting there, thank you, honey, about what to post or not to post online. I was overwhelmed by the intensity of the scale of the posts, triggered by the stories, but feeling strangely comforted by the fact that it wasn't just me. While at the same time, I was horrified by the sheer number of stories that were surfacing. To quote their book, she said, "Even the nation's most powerful publications could not bear the entire weight of the reckoning. Journalists stepped in when the system failed." But what blew me away even more was another quote from the book. How soon would Megan be back from maternity leave? They did this all with little kids. We can't imagine two people more appropriate for the library's inaugural social impact event. Before we begin, I just want to thank the planning committee. You guys are awesome, and the library staff. Being able to pull this off with COVID was unreal, so thank you. So without further delay, I would like to introduce and thank our moderator for today's conversation, Joan Gillman. Joan is the former COO of Time Warner Cable. She has a distinguished career in telecommunications and technology, starting all the way back of the internet in 1995 and to 5G today. She currently holds several board director positions, corporate executive, and industry association positions. Joan has paved the way for other women to make their mark and has broken several glass ceilings along the way. She is truly a remarkable female leader, Westport's own Joan Gillman. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. It's really amazing to be here today. I'm delighted and honored to share the stage with two of the most extraordinary Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists and women. So thank you. I want to start with just a little bit more of a bio for Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey. It was 4 years ago that they broke the story about Harvey Weinstein, and we'll spend some time talking about that. But why was it so relevant? They broke decades of silent whispering campaigns and really powered and supercharged the Me Too movement. And it was their investigative reporting that made the difference. And we're going to explore some of those themes today. But then they collaborated to write a book, which if you haven't read is really incredible. It's a book that's well worth rereading. And that is a book that's about how things change, and I really want to pick up on that theme. Their work was not just telling the Harvey Weinstein story, but it was really digging in to what it took to bring about change in the Me Too movement and bring about change in corporate culture. But that didn't stop. Their collaboration continues. They have a new book coming out this November that's called Chasing the Truth, a young journalist's guide to investigative reporting. So their collaboration continues to really help young journalists. And my daughter and many of her friends write for the local school newspaper, so I can't wait to order lots of copies and hand them out with the students. And last, but not least, there is a movie coming out. And I understand both of you are walk-ons. You're acting in the movie, but you're not playing yourselves. So we'll have a little bit of fun talking about that towards the end. But thank you. They've also published so many incredible investigative articles, and we'll touch on some of that as well. So let me turn to questions, because I think that's why everyone is here today, and ask you, 4 years later after the Weinstein story breaks, how do you look back on, Jodi, and I'll start with you, how do you look back on that story and all the work that went into that story, and how do you reflect on that period of time in your lives?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to start by thanking everybody here on Megan and my behalf, Joan, Siobhan, to everybody at the library. We're thrilled to be out of our apartments. We're thrilled to be in Connecticut, which post-pandemic, even going an hour and a half away from home feels like a kind of grand adventure. This is pretty much the most beautiful local library we have ever seen. It's pretty stunning. And yeah, we're thrilled to be in conversation with you on what does feel like a really momentous day. As everybody here knows, nobody planned it this way. This event was supposed to happen, I think, first in June 2020. But here we are on the 4th anniversary of the publication of the Weinstein story. And I think we'd be remiss not to note that Harvey Weinstein had a home in Westport.
Yes,
so probably not your local favorite hometown hero, but it feels really relevant and kind of significant to be coming to this place to discuss this. So really, from both of us, thank you so much. That I think there are two things to say in answer to your question. One about what we knew before the publication of the story, and one about what we know now. Before the publication of the story, we had no idea how this was going to shake out. We were very worried, less for ourselves than on our sources' behalfs. Ashley Judd was putting her career on the line to come forward about Harvey Weinstein. We tell the backstory in the book. Given everything that's happened, I think it's easy to forget that we were very worried that these women would be maligned, that Weinstein would be able to fight back very powerfully, that this would become a kind of big he said, she said debate. Gwyneth Paltrow originally did not go on the record because she said, this is going to turn into a tawdry celebrity sex scandal. There's going to be like the cover of the New York Post with me and Harvey Weinstein and sex, and that thought is just too awful to contemplate. And so, so to see that the world accepted this reporting so readily, that facts and brave sources shone through, that the women were, it hasn't been easy for all of the women, but they have gotten a great deal of admiration and positive feedback and reinforcement. And most of all, something really changed. Not everything changed, but there was this powerful moment of mass accountability where hundreds of men lost their jobs because of these kinds of allegations. So I think the second thing to say is that in retrospect, this story just took, we'd already been journalists for a long time before we did this, and this story just took everything we already felt about journalism and the power of the written word, and it just underlined it 3 times and added 6 exclamation points to the end. And part of, I think, the reason we feel that way is that Me Too is such a powerful force 4 years later. Here we've all been frozen inside our homes for so long and been told to stand 6 feet apart from each other, and a lot of our offices kind of barely exist at the moment. And yet, R. Kelly was convicted last week after decades of allegations. Governor Cuomo had to step down because of this devastating Attorney General's report. So what we can see now is that Me Too is this, we're all living through this enormous social change caused by it. It's this force that continues to ripple throughout all of our lives.
So let's pick up on that. You make it sound so easy, but what the book really talks about is the process of getting that article published was extremely hard. And you had many moments where you had doubts and you overcame them and you persevered. Megan, can you maybe speak to that?
Sure.
To that process?
Yeah, well, to go back to when's Megan coming back from maternity leave moment, It's true. When this investigation first began 4 years ago, Jodi was at the Times doing the reporting by herself. And within those first weeks, she was having very hushed conversations with Rose McGowan, Gwyneth Paltrow, Ashley Judd, women, very different actresses from very different backgrounds who didn't know each other, but were telling her eerily similar stories about very troubling encounters that they had had with Harvey Weinstein. And yet, as Jodi mentioned, it wasn't just Gwyneth. Everybody was scared to go on the record. And so, I had joined the New York Times earlier in 2016, and I had come on board during the presidential race and had done coverage of then candidate Donald Trump, including allegations of sexual misconduct against him. And I'd worked really closely with some of the women who went on the record with allegations against him. And then, Trump was elected. I went off and had a baby. So anyway, in the spring of 2017, I got a phone call from Jodi. Like, I'm home alone, surrounded by dirty diapers and bottles and feeling totally overwhelmed. And she knew that I had done stories not just on allegations against Donald Trump, but also I had worked on stories about sex crimes and previous publications I had worked for. And so she calls and she says, listen, I'm starting to do this reporting. We didn't even know each other at the time. I was actually really struggling, I'll be honest, on maternity leave. And so anyway, she calls and she says, I've just started to have these conversations, but these women are terrified to go on the record. And do you have any advice? I know that you have you've worked with a lot of women in these situations and stories before. What do you say? I mean, when you're doing these phone calls, when you're knocking on these doors, you're often asking these people to talk about what may very well be the most painful experience of their life. There's so many reasons not to go on the record, to not participate in a story like this. People there was a playbook that a lot of women were familiar with, that they would be the ones to suffer damage to their careers, that they would be the ones to be attacked if they spoke out about what happened. And so I told Jodi that the case that I had made in the past was, we can't change what happened to you in the past, but if you work with us, if you go on the record, we may be able to put your private pain to public use. We may be able to protect other women from being hurt, and we may be able to hold this bad guy accountable. And so that was really the first, that was the beginning, looking back, that was the beginning of our partnership. And that was a case that we did made moving forward with our reporting. But we also realized that we were never going to be able to publish the story if we just waited for women to go on the record, that we had this dream that everybody was gonna hold hands and jump on the record together. And we realized that the forces against that were just too great. And that's why we, in those following months, set out on other paths of reporting. We set out to collect records, internal company records, in which there was documentation of Harvey Weinstein's wrongdoing. And we can talk more about these secret settlements that had been used to silence women who had come forward with them. They had become a de facto way for dealing with sexual harassment, in some cases sexual assault in this country, and they'd been used to hide wrongdoing. And we had figured out that if you could kind of piece together that trail of financial settlements, it could actually help bring it to light. And so in the very end, when Jodi and I actually went back to some of these women that we'd been working with and asked them to go on the record, we were coming to them with like a mountain of evidence. And that's one of the things that we wanted to do in the book, was to take people behind the scenes and through all those different paths of reporting that we took to finally be able to publish that story.
So let's build on that. There's a theme to all of your reporting in that you've looked at corporate cultures and corporate policies that need to change. In reading the book, the breakthrough, or what you were looking for, seemed to be proof of harassment in the workplace, not just the cover-up agreements. So Jodi, maybe you could talk about that, because it was months into the investigation before you found there was an internal memo that had been written complaining about the corporate culture.
Absolutely. So I think a really common misperception about this work is that it's all about sex. It is obviously to some extent, but we feel strongly that it's all about power. When you really look at Weinstein's victims, granted, there are so many of them. I mean, about 100 women have come forward about Weinstein that, at that number, you obviously get to a diverse set of women. But there are some really powerful common denominators. For the most part, they were at the beginning of their careers. Even the big stars were not necessarily huge stars when this happened to them. One of the things that was the most disturbing to discover, we had initially started reporting on actresses, and their stories are obviously very powerful, but something clicked for us when we found that second strand of the story, which is that Weinstein had abused his own employees. And that's significant. And the actress stories don't diminish the assistant stories or vice versa. They kind of amplify each other. They're two halves of the same coin. Because the assistant stories really say a lot about workplace sexual harassment. These were not dates. This was not some producer in a bar who was hitting on women. There could be no mistaking this for a conventional romantic interaction. These were women who were told that when you work for Harvey Weinstein, you work in his hotel suite because that's his office when they traveled. Believe it or not, a normal part of the job was to have to wrest him out of bed in the morning when he was naked and get him in the shower and turn on the shower for him. So this was, basically like a recipe for predation. And some of the victims, like Rowena Chu, who very bravely went on the record for the book, describes being a sort of young, intimidated assistant and saying she was supposed to be reading scripts with him one night, and he kept, essentially trying to make sexual inroads with her. And the way she tells the story, she says she keeps telling him, can we get back to the scripts now? Can we get back to the work at hand? So this is really about power. This is about women, whether they were actresses or young assistants, they came to the workplace wanting what we all want. They wanted a piece of the action. They wanted opportunity. And basically, Weinstein's, the form of predation that he used is that he was able to use that ambition against them and to try to and when they wanted to get ahead in their careers, that became sort of the pathway that he used to victimize them sexually.
So let's pivot a little bit to a really big theme in the book and your ability to get the story, and that's trust. I think what I was most struck by is that your editors were saying don't trust anyone, but your task at hand was to get hundreds of strangers to trust you, and the ones that ultimately break to give you the proof points that you need to get the women to go on the record and to get the story were surprises to you. So could Megan maybe talk a little bit about the contrast of don't trust anyone and get everyone to trust you first, and then maybe speak to the element of surprise and how that trust works to get the data that you need.
Sure, yeah. No, I think that you're referencing, this was a memorable moment for us in the investigation was, when I came back from maternity leave, I joined Jodi on the investigation, and within a matter of weeks, we were sitting in the office of the executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet. And he had encounters with Harvey Weinstein before in the newspaper's coverage of his productions, and even in 2015, when there was this rare moment when a woman, an Italian model, went to the New York police and said that she had just been sexually abused by Weinstein at a work meeting in his office. And so there was some coverage that went along with that. And Dean Baquet had encountered the kind of tactics that Weinstein used in trying to manipulate news coverage and intimidate editors and reporters. And he also had a track record of, keeping Weinstein and his attorneys at arm's length and not letting them interfere with the news coverage. So Jodi and I are sitting in the office with Dean and our editor, Rebecca, and another editor who was part of this project. And he just, he said to Jodi and I very explicitly, he said, basically watch your back. You know, assume that every single phone call you're having is being recorded. Assume you're being trailed by private investigators. And you know, just be careful. Just be careful, because don't underestimate what this guy is going to do in trying to stop your reporting. And you know, and that's the case with, we're not the only reporters at the paper who are tackling high stakes reporting and covering powerful individuals or institutions. And we also knew that if private investigators did trail us and go through our garbage, that they would find dirty diapers. We didn't have a lot, you know, we weren't that intimidated by that. But it did sort of set the tone of, in terms of this, almost like we were playing a game of chess, like we were on the side of the truth, and we knew that we didn't know the extent of the apparatus that was working to conceal the truth at the time, but as we did more reporting, it was coming into sharper and sharper focus. So, for example, we suspected that we were being trailed by private investigators. You know, it wasn't until much later that we realized that he had in fact hired an investigative firm of a whole other order called Black Cube, which is made up of these former Israeli spies and agents who had adopted fake identities to try to dupe us and our sources. One even pretended to be a women's rights advocate in contacting Jodi. And there were lawyers who were by Weinstein's side trying to conceal the truth. David Boies, one of the most sort of famed litigators who had become famous in part for helping to win the case of gay marriage before the Supreme Court, had behind the scenes for 15 years helped Weinstein conceal and spin these allegations of sexual misconduct that would surface. But you know, there were also other surprising figures that we encountered along the way who were helping to hide the truth. You know, Lisa Bloom, one of the, you know, daughter of Gloria Allred, these two famous feminist attorneys, probably the most famous feminist attorneys in the country. Lisa Bloom had crossed sides in 2017 to go to work for Harvey Weinstein. So there were these really memorable moments where she was showing up at the New York Times by Harvey Weinstein's side, and what was a pretty surprise twist for us. But then, you know, the flip side, so there were these, in some cases, cynical, surprising figures and, you know, moments of revelation that we had in terms of the people who were working to hide the truth. But as we were doing the reporting, we also encountered, you know, a variety of really inspiring people who for years had been walking around with these feelings of like, what I'm seeing is wrong and I want to do something about it. In fact, there were even some people who we went to who had spoken to reporters in the past only to see those stories killed. So we also had to encounter that fear or that skepticism, people saying, even if I participate in this investigation, Harvey Weinstein's just going to walk into the New York Times and get it killed, the story killed. Why should I participate in this? And we had to say, listen, we can't speak to what's happened before, but when we show up on your doorstep, we're showing up with the whole institution of the New York Times behind our back. And it was, in the end, you know, there were these women who were really brave, some of the former employees, some of the actresses who just couldn't stay quiet anymore. But there were also these surprising figures like Erwin Ryder, the corporate accountant at the Weinstein Company for 30 years, who was the one who slipped Jodi that internal company record. Turns out he had tried at various points to alert other executives, to confront Weinstein, to go to the board. None of it had worked. So finally, when a journalist is sitting across from him at a bar, he says, okay, I feel so committed to this truth, the need for this to come out, that I'm going to take this, even though I'm probably putting my career on the line as well.
There's so many themes that have come through in what your answers and in the book about perseverance. Maybe, Jodi, you could take this first. You've said about Megan that she's knocked on many doors and it never gets easier. Talk a little bit about, I mean, many of us are parents, your parents, and there's such an effort to raise children with resilience and grit and ability to persevere. What have you learned through the process, and what enables you to stick with it when it gets really hard and you're not moving as quickly as you would like and you're facing all these obstacles?
Well, first of all, if there are New York Times subscribers in the room, I think we owe you thanks because you paid for this investigation and you paid for it before you knew what you were getting. You had no idea. Every day, it's an act of faith to subscribe to a newspaper because you don't know what the world will bring and you don't know what we're working on inside the building or right now inside our homes. And so trusting us that we're sort of doing the hard work for society is something we really, really, really appreciate. And I think what I would tell your kids if they were here is that we work in a milieu in which not giving up is prized. You can't walk into the investigations unit of the New York Times, which is, the group that produced the Trump tax investigation and the Cambridge Analytica investigation of Facebook. You can't really go into an editor and say about your story, well, I called one or two people, but nobody was calling me back, so I think I'm just going to move on to something else. That is not the ethos. That would not earn you a good employee evaluation. That is not, those are not the kinds of responses that sort of earn you a pat on the back at the paper. In fact, what I find is that, first of all, my partnership with Megan, our relationship with our editor, Rebecca Corbett, the whole ecosystem of the paper is designed to support you in those really hard situations. So it's not just sort of our individual personal initiative that keeps us going, but you're right. I mean, showing up on somebody's doorstep is awkward, potentially invasive and scary for that person. We always, we had a thing during the Weinstein investigation where we would wear dresses and write a nice note when we were about to do that because we always wanted to come across as the nice girls, as reporters and not scary, threatening figures. It is, in the time of COVID, you really almost can't knock on somebody's door because the barriers have grown so much stronger. You can freak people out with their children. Megan tells a story in the book where she was able to speak to a victim, but her children were right there, and so you've got to be incredibly sensitive. And it's also kind of a leap on our part. Like when I went to talk to Rowena Chu in California, I got on a plane to California without, this is a woman who was not answering any of my messages, not on Facebook, not on text, not on email. And so I flew to California without even knowing, whether she would be home or whether she would be willing to exchange a word with me. But we work in a system that supports that says, make every phone call. We're going to give you the time. We're going to give you the space. We're going to give you the expense budget to fly across the country, even if we're not sure it will yield, because that's what's required, to do the really hard stories. And the freedom, I think in a way and maybe this translates back to your kids in some way, I think the only way you can achieve something is to free yourself from the fear of failure. If I think it would have been very hard to get on that flight to California feeling that Megan and Rebecca would have regarded me as a failure if Rowena hadn't been home or if I failed to connect with her. I think to get on that plane, I needed to know that my colleagues and my editor had my back and that they were almost conceptually there with me at that front door, no matter what happened. And so, I have a 15-year-old in high school. I know all about the expectations we layer on these kids. And I guess as a parent in the high school game now, I think one of the hardest things to see to your kids is, I'm giving you space to fall on your face here. Like the only goal is to try. Like we're not going to forget about outcome, but we're going to allow, like, how do you build a system for your kids where they are essentially allowed to take risks that where you truly cannot, sort of predict the outcome. But I'm grateful to say that is still the professional environment that we're operating in.
And what, maybe you can build on this, what people don't see is how many stories don't make it.
Right.
Exactly.
And maybe you can speak to that, because it goes to this issue of taking the risk.
Right.
And
well, I also think in terms of kind of what are the takeaway messages here for young people and kids, and Jodi and I have spoken to audiences across the country, and we have been so impressed by the young people who come to, who really connect with this work. And we think that there's good reason for it, because, we 4 years later don't think that this is a depressing story. We think that this is a really uplifting story, and that this is a story about, when you see a bully, whether it's in the workplace or in a profession or at school or in any other kind of aspect of life, how do you respond? Is that something that do you sort of shrink in fear and say the bullies are always going to win? Or do you say, or do you find that to be invigorating and motivation to actually move forward and help bring the truth to light? And I think that that's really what this story was about. And we learned more and more about this kind of powerful apparatus that Weinstein had at his disposal. And it wasn't just the powerful attorneys. I mean, he had turned his companies into weapons of predation. Like there was nothing that he didn't touch that didn't somehow become complicit in his abuse and his bullying. But on the other side were all these forces of truth and goodness and compassion, and people. A lot of these women ultimately did care about what was going to happen to other women who ended up in Weinstein's path, and found motivation to speak out, if not just for themselves, but to help protect other people. And I think that that's, as investigative reporters, we wake up in the morning because we want to hold the powerful to account. We want to stand up to bullies. And for us, there's nothing better than those moments when you've got the facts and you've got the goods. And you say, like, okay, come in here with all, and there were these moments. I mean, one of the last moments before we went to publication was when Weinstein barged into the New York Times uninvited with a whole pack of attorneys and folders of information, photographs, and other dirt that they had tried to dig up on the women that were going to be in our stories that they thought they could use to smear them and stop the publication. And that's one of those moments where you're like, okay, bring it on, guys, because guess what? We've got the truth. We've got these brave sources, and you're no match for that. And so I think that there's just, for young people looking for like lessons in perseverance, the ability to, and standing up to bullies, and the power of the truth, I think that that's really so many of the themes that really have come through and played out over the last 4 years for us. But listen, along the way, we have, like Jodi and I as investigative journalists, have certainly stumbled and done reporting into, we have reached roadblocks that we weren't able to overcome. We also talk in this book about all of the due diligence that we do. I think that there's, especially as Me Too took off and there were different types of, women and other victims were coming forward with their stories, and some on social media, some in other publications that did stories a little differently than the way that we've done it. But you can see in the course of this book how rigorous of a process we go through in order to publish a story like this. It's not a he said, she said. I mean, we would never turn around and just publish one person's account without doing really significant due diligence. And that's with all the people we cover. So even when we're talking to somebody like Gwyneth Paltrow, which was somewhat of a surreal moment the first time we went out to talk to her, she tells this really upsetting story about an encounter that she had with Weinstein at what was supposed to be a work meeting in a hotel room. She says she got out and went home and told her boyfriend at the time, Brad Pitt. And so we're saying, okay, well, we're going to have to talk to Brad Pitt about that. We're going to have to get that corroboration, just so you know. And because we do that with everybody, And so listen, have there been times where we've gathered accounts from women and gone out and done that corroboration and it doesn't quite check out? Mm-hmm. And no matter how compelling we think that account is, it's not going to be in the pages of the New York Times. And so I don't think that people really appreciate how, you only see the stories and the accounts that we worked so hard to be able to publish and that went through all of that due diligence. And there have there have been many stories and many passive reporting that you don't see, that don't pan out because they just don't meet the standards that we have.
It's a really important point that you've made in many of your other interviews, and people will often ask you about believing women when they come forward, and you bring a journalistic lens to that. Can you speak a little bit to that conflict? You really can't just believe them. You have to back up the facts.
Sure. Well, so, really around this time, 2017, 2018, we started to see the phrase "believe women" take off, and we understood exactly the sentiment behind it. I mean, our work is about getting women's stories into the paper and essentially getting to see the world through a more female perspective. So,
and seeing all the systems that haven't listened to those voices.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in terms of general broad principle, we totally get it. But from the beginning, we felt that the phrase "believe women" just doesn't comport with journalistic principles. When Megan was a cub reporter in Wisconsin, her editor had a sign on his desk saying, "If your mother tells you she loves you, check it out." Because everything in journalism has to be scrutinized, and especially with these allegations of sexual misconduct. These are serious allegations. They can ruin somebody's career. They are potentially criminal. The material is incredibly upsetting. It's incredibly delicate. The bar to publication needs to be high. You need to have, if there's one thing you take away from our reporting, I want you to know that we don't just throw these stories in the paper. They are heavily vetted. And to protect us and the victims and the accused, they need to meet certain legal standards. So part of what we talk about, say when we talk to student groups, is that we really talk about the importance of fair, painstaking investigations, and how that's not an impediment to social change, it's a key to social change. What we experienced with the Weinstein story is that once it was published and once Ronan Farrow's stories were published, there wasn't like a big social debate over what Harvey Weinstein did or didn't do to women. Instead, it was much more like the moral horror, how could this have happened? How could one guy have accumulated so many allegations? And that's because the factual basis was so strong. Whether people were on the right or on the left, men and women, there was broad factual consensus about what Harvey Weinstein had done to women. And so that served, that was a sturdy, well-built platform for the social debate that followed. So, those tough questions we asked and like scrutinizing, even Gwyneth Paltrow's story and asking to call Brad Pitt and whatever, that we were not creating barriers to women being believed by being tough on every aspect of the story and allowing Harvey Weinstein a chance to address the allegations before publication. We felt like we were actually creating conditions where the stories of these women could be widely accepted.
So you've touched on how hopeful the story and positive the story is and has been, and the work of the book. Let's come into the present. We were talking in the green room, and you were talking about how much change you see this in your travels, promoting the book, doing your work. you do see a change in the way people are responding and reacting, and a lot has happened, and you touched on this in the beginning of the panel, of people who've been addressed as also predators and are no longer in their jobs. Talk a little bit more about what you think has changed in a meaningful way and what hasn't changed.
It's a good question, and it's another reason that we've continued to report, not just, we watched with wonder as the dam broke, and leading up to publication of that story 4 years ago, Jodi and I had no idea what was going to happen. We were so laser focused on making sure we had an airtight story that was going to withstand any of the challenges that we knew Weinstein was going to make. I mean, he was threatening to sue us. And so there was even one point when we were riding a taxi, we were in a taxi back from the Times newsroom late one night right before publication, and I turned to Jodi in the quiet of the cab and I said, do you think anybody's going to read this story? Which just shows how we just could not have predicted what happened in the following weeks and months. But we did feel that change immediately. I mean, within hours of the story being published, Jodi and I were starting to get phone calls and email. I mean, for so long we'd been out there trying to search for these accounts and get women to speak, and having doors slammed in our face and being hung up on. And all of a sudden, all of these women started to come to us and started to come to the New York Times with their own accounts of abuse and harassment, and not just against Weinstein, against men from all different professions across the country. And so that was for us the first moment of being like, oh my goodness, something is shifting, the dam is breaking, the silence, this sort of veil of silence is starting to be lifted. And Jodi and I have been in journalism for 20 years, and I had never experienced or witnessed anything like it. And I even remember a couple weeks into our additional reporting, going on social media, taking a break from our work and going onto Facebook and seeing my own friends and family members and old colleagues sharing their stories under the Me Too hashtag, and it brought me to tears. I still, in some ways, I still can't quite believe everything that has changed. On the one hand, it feels like everything has changed. On the other hand, 4 years later, sometimes it feels like nothing has changed. And one of the reasons that Jodi and I kept reporting into this social change was because we also saw that as it pushed further and further out, it got more complicated, and also it got more controversial. And I think that the way that we see it, there's sort of three unresolved questions that we think explain how and why Me Too can, 4 years later, feel more complex than it did in that moment when the dam first broke. And I think so the first question that we see is, what behavior is under scrutiny? Are we just talking about serious rapes and like very clear-cut sexual harassment in the workplace? Are we talking more about uncomfortable dates or some of the behavior that can happen in the hallways of high schools that at one used to be seen as playful, but now can seem like something more sinister? And what's the second question? And there's not agreement on that. The second unresolved question is, how do we vet allegations, accusations of wrongdoing? We know how we do it at the New York Times. I mean, we wrote a book about how we do this work, and the sort of journalistic standards that come to bear when you're vetting these stories. But go to an HR department, more importantly, go into the court of public opinion, and I think that things are much more murky. There's not a consensus on how we get to what actually happened, on a common understanding of the truth. And then I think the third unresolved question that Jodi and I see continuing to dog us and dog society more broadly is the question of accountability. It's so easy for people to insist on accountability, but when it comes time to assign it, that is much more complicated. What should punishment look like? Should there be, are we embracing a sense of rehabilitation and a return back after a certain period of time. And so I think that, and I'd be curious once we get to the questions in the audience how everybody else feels about this, but Jodi and I just think that those three questions really get at the root of why it does not feel like we have all moved forward with a common set of rules. It's like the new rules kind of got shown to not be working and get swept aside, but I don't think we've come up with like a new clear set of rules that we all feel confident in.
There's one final question for me, and then we'll take questions from the audience. We see that playing out in some of the aftermath of Cuomo's resignation and the uncertainty inside the Me Too movement. Maybe you could speak, Jodi, a little bit to what you're observing and people who have been leaders in advocacy for women's issues who then get too close to power and how it interferes with potentially the ability to move this effort forward in terms of protecting women in the workplace and elsewhere. Any thoughts as to what you see in your journalistic coverage of the Me Too movement?
Sure. So I was walking around Prospect Park in Brooklyn one day this summer with a colleague, and we got a call from the paper saying that essentially they wanted to bring me into the coverage of what was going on with Governor Cuomo because the Attorney General's report had just come out saying, this was this devastating report listing 11 allegations against him with a lot of evidence, including the now famous state trooper allegation in which, this woman who was sworn to protect him said that she was targeted by him, in fact. So the paper wanted essentially me to do some work on, why was this significant in the Me Too movement? A governor was, this was the first time, I think, that such a prominent political official at the state level had to resign in the Me Too era. What did it all mean? And so anyway, I started writing about that. And one of the things it led me to was the discovery that the leaders of Time's Up, which, Megan and I watched the birth of Time's Up. Like we remember every second of a few months after the Weinstein investigation, watching the Golden Globes and seeing these Hollywood actresses becoming these massive champions of this cause. It was like they were throwing off the chains of the casting couch that had dogged Hollywood for all of these years and declaring their liberation and kind of becoming activists. Well, all these years later, long story short, it turns out that the Time's Up leaders had ended up kind of on the wrong, not entirely on the wrong side, but somewhat on the wrong side of the Cuomo scandal. And for Megan and I, it was like deja vu again, because as Megan mentioned, we have seen all of these powerful women, including some very avowed feminists, end up essentially protecting the men instead of helping victims. So it led to first of all, it led to the blow up of Time's Up, which, a kernel of it still exists as an organization, but, entire boards have resigned, the board chair, the person who ran the organization, they're all out the door now, and it sort of remains to be seen how much that organization will really survive. And it's led to this whole new round, I think, of questions. But I think it still does feel like progress, because at every stage of sort of the modern Me Too era, we've learned more and more about how these dynamics operate and what it takes to fight them. And I think the other thing that I know I have a strong sensation of, and I wonder if you do too, is that this is what it feels to live through. This is what it feels like to live through social change, right? We're seeing the rules change before our eyes. In some ways, the really black and white cases that we write about, like the Harvey Weinstein one, are easier because there's very little moral question about whether what he did is wrong or not. When all of us go back to our offices, if we ever do, these questions are going to reemerge about, like, office parties where one person gets drunk and makes an inappropriate comment, or one colleague, puts his hand on a woman's back, and was that a sexual overture or was it not? I remember about a year after we broke the story, I went to an all-female dinner party with like maybe 15 or 20 people, and I wanted to see sort of what the social consensus was in the room. So I asked around the table the question of, in the workplace, is it okay for a man to tell a woman that she's wearing a nice dress? And nobody around the table agreed. It was sort of like there were 18 chairs around the table and there were 18 different takes on whether this was okay or not. And I found it, at that point I felt like I was pivoting from being a tough investigative reporter to being kind of a sociologist who was more just observing the fallout and saying, this is incredibly fascinating and it's going to take a great deal of conversation to ever get to kind of a new consensus in society about how this should operate.
Wonderful answer. Thank you. Let me move to questions from the audience. We have some really good ones, and we haven't touched on this first one. Does anything in your journalistic process offer opportunities to improve the process of bringing forward women's stories in the political sphere, in the political process? Specifically, Anita Hill, Christina Blasey Ford. We've seen Cuomo. That's the political landscape as well. But talk about how much harder it is in the political landscape than it is in business.
Listen, I mean, first of all, there's, when you are participating in a piece of journalism like this as a source, as a victim, it's one of the things that's so hard is you just don't know what's going to happen. And Jodi and I have the case that we make that we genuinely believe in, but we can't guarantee what the outcome's going to be. And I think but what we can say with certainty is that every time these stories play out in the political realm, it is guaranteed to be messier. It's guaranteed to be harder. I did reporting on, as I mentioned, women who came forward with allegations against Donald Trump. And I remember being on an airplane with one of the women as she was debating whether or not to make the leap on to going on the record and how nervous she was. And I still talk to her today, and I know how much her life changed after that moment, after saying yes. I know that she was that there were some people that she knew who she didn't know who thought that she was like a hero, and that there were other people who attacked her, that there were people in her own family who continued to support Trump even after she came forward. This was a young woman who had worked in Trump Tower as a secretary in a business that was one floor down. And she had a chance encounter with him outside the elevator, and as she tells it, he forcibly kissed her, and she went home crying to her boyfriend. She called her sister. It was something that was really, and she basically left New York after that. It was a pretty upsetting experience for her. She's from Ohio. I was there too when Trump, I remember calling Trump to get comment for that and other stories, and his reaction, he screamed at me. He called me a disgusting, he said all the women were liars. He said I was a disgusting human being. He threatened to sue the New York Times. He went out on the campaign trail. I don't need to tell you guys this. You know what he did. So I watched that, and I had a front row seat to that, and some of the women who were affected by that. And I also, when we, within the first year of the Weinstein story, we also had a pretty front row seat to Christine Blasey Ford. Jodi was there behind the scenes with her legal team the day that she testified. I got the first interview with her in California months later, and I remember meeting her at this restaurant, and she showed up with a baseball cap pulled down, and she was still in hiding. It was months later after she had testified, and she hadn't returned home. She was still getting death threats. So the same thing where she was, on the one hand, there were so many young women out there who thought that she was a hero and she was getting all this praise and positive feedback. On the other hand, she was so scared of the threats that she was getting that she had not returned home. And so I think that it's just a reminder that, like, especially in the political realm, whether it's allegations against a Democrat or a Republican, it almost doesn't matter because both sides kind of take up the allegations to use against each other as weapons. And the women almost, in some cases, can feel like they become collateral damage. And so it doesn't mean, once again, it doesn't mean that women should not be coming forward within the political realm. It just means that every single person who does that needs to know that it's just you're operating at another level of risk.
Well, building on that, the next question: when political and cultural movements affect society this deeply, there's usually a counter or anti-reaction. How do you think this counter-reaction will take shape?
It's a great question. I think we've seen it already in a number of ways. I think we saw it. I want to say first, I want to start this way. I think it's important to say that I believe the Me Too movement has been very, very, very successful on the whole, because I don't want to go on to describe some of the forces of opposition or critique in a way that lacks context. This movement, I mean, it's great. It's had a number of really enormous achievements, most of them, I think, just in the social sphere in terms of how we think about this stuff, in terms of the level of sensitivity and compassion that people show, kind of recognition of the problem, sense of changing social standards. I think probably its biggest achievement is in the corporate world. The standards for the business world, especially the elite business world, have really changed. Sexual misconduct in the workplace is now a risk factor for a business. 10 or 15 years ago, you're nodding with all of your corporate experience. 10 or 15 years ago, I think something like this would have been much more likely to be brushed under the rug, maybe not even discussed at the board level. Our sense now is that boards are incredibly alert. CEOs are alert. They know this is something that can bring down your reputation. This can cost you your job. This can cost you your business. There are tons of case examples. I'm not going to recite the whole thing now, but I highly recommend looking at the entire saga of the CEO of McDonald's and how his tenure and then his compensation, which was sort of a story of outsized CEO compensation gone wrong that came back to bite him in the end. And if you look at, that entire story could practically be a book unto itself. But what it shows you is that, like, a mainstream corporation like McDonald's can essentially not afford to have this as a problem anymore. So, with that said, I think we do see a level of threat and resistance that was there from the beginning and builds. I think you saw it in some of the ways that President Trump dealt with the allegations. Some of the things he said about his alleged victims, she wasn't pretty enough. I never would have chosen her. She wasn't my type. Even in some cases kind of mocking, using his public megaphone to mock some of the women who were coming forward about him and others. I think the other thing we see is that the subject causes just a tremendous amount of fear and discomfort, and you do hear of examples of men, powerful men, just sort of shutting it down by saying things like, I won't mentor a younger woman, or I won't even have, a drink with a 25-year-old female employee because, I'm so afraid of being accused of something. But, I'm not sure that the right word for that reaction is actually backlash. It's almost like insecurity, right? It's almost like this thing is so powerful and this thing has already won to a degree that I can't even control, and so I'm gonna try to exert control by mediating who I have breakfast with or whatever. But to me, somebody who is making that move is almost declaring that the battle is already lost. And then the last thing I'll say is that part of what to watch is just who's in charge, because there's sort of two theories about combating sexual misconduct in the workplace. One is that you try to address it directly, but the other is just that you change the gender equation and put more women into power. So look at all the women who got these big jobs after these men were unseated. Look at, the Weinstein Company board, which was really kind of an enabler of Weinstein's activities. It was an all-male board. I mean, an all-male board. Who has an all-male board anymore?
There's still quite a few out there.
There's still quite a few out there, but it doesn't
It is changing.
It doesn't have the degree, it's a bit taboo. It looks really bad. It doesn't have the degree of social acceptability that it has, that it used to. And so I think what we are, again, I think it's sort of the sound. I think the feeling of living through social change is that there's going to be resistance and there's going to be debate.
And just building on that, for NASDAQ to come out and require diversity on the boards is, coming years after people have been trying to make this an important issue so that the boardroom conversation does change, and it's now happening. So there's a lot happening in the corporate world.
And that was another part of, this was part of the continuation of our reporting, is that we reported into the Weinstein Company and that all-male board, and what did they know, when did they know it, and what did they do about it. And the year, in 2015, just several years before our investigation, they saw there were multiple allegations that came to the attention of the board. They knew about the police report that had been made against Weinstein. They knew about this internal memo that spelled out allegations of rampant sexual harassment by the boss. And they were so much more concerned with liability. They just saw this in terms of liability. So what did they do that year? They renewed Weinstein's contract, but they put in these clauses that basically said that if he ever had to pay a settlement to a victim, that he would have to pay a fine to the company. So it really wasn't, there was nothing in their response to the glimpses of wrongdoing that they saw that suggested that they actually cared about the women who worked at the company or who were in the films and productions that this company put on. It was really just such a narrow focus on liability. And what they, of course, missed was that in the process of having such a narrow view and obsession with liability, they oversaw the elephant in the room that ultimately brought the whole company crashing down. And we even reported we got copies of notes from these meetings, the emergency meetings that the Weinstein Company board held on the eve of our story, within hours of it being published. And there were some members of these all-male board who even then, even after our story came out, were saying don't worry, this is all gonna go away, as if they were gonna kind of stick by the Weinstein. But his brother Bob saw the writing on the wall and was like, you're finished. And it was within a couple of days of the story that Weinstein was, that he was basically fired from his own company. But the company dissolved. The Weinstein Company does not exist anymore because this issue ultimately took it down. And so I think that there's actually really interesting lessons in corporate governance and broader workplace guidelines that emerged from this reporting. I would also say in regards to what does the backlash look like, we also got a front row view of it in the Weinstein trial itself. I don't know how closely you guys followed it, but we had wondered for months and months and months after our reporting, there were these criminal investigations because not only were there allegations of sexual harassment that emerged in the more than 80 women who came forward against Weinstein, and sexual harassment is a civil offense. You're not gonna be criminally charged for sexual harassment. But there were also many allegations of sex crimes, of crimes that were made. And we kept wondering, is there gonna be a criminal case? Is this guy gonna Sure, he's lost his job, he's lost his family, he's lost his reputation, but a question that we kept hearing was, is this guy ever gonna go to jail? And so finally, there was a criminal case that was brought in New York, and we covered it. And the attorney who represented Weinstein was a woman, an attorney called Donna Rotuno, and she's from Chicago, and she's made her career representing men who claim that they've been wrongly accused. And so she shows up in New York and kind of went on a media blitz in which she was really articulating not just a defense of Weinstein, but an attack of the whole Me Too movement. She made the case, and this was a case that was just made throughout the trial, that the criminal case against Weinstein was evidence that the Me Too movement had gone too far, that the women had actually used him to their professional advantage, that they should have never gone to hotel rooms if they didn't expect something sexual to happen. And this female attorney was the one who got up and just made these arguments over and over and over again. And there was one point where I actually interviewed her on the New York Times Daily podcast. And I said at one point, I asked her, Donna, have you ever been a victim of sexual assault? And she said, no, because I would never put myself in that position. So we knew going into this trial that, this was one particular case about one particular man, but we also knew that in some ways his defense team was framing it as a test of the whole Me Too movement. And, in the end, he was found guilty and is in prison, and the jury didn't buy those arguments. And you could hear that in the R. Kelly trial last week, too, that the defense team was trying to use some of the same arguments of like, well, when you were 17 and you went to the R. Kelly trial, weren't you dancing suggestively? And there was one point where the judge said to the defense attorney, come into the 21st century. We don't do that anymore here, which I thought was really heartening. But we've seen, it's not just in these particular criminal trials, there are these moments in our sort of culture where you can see a sort of battle where there is there certainly is a backlash.
I want to build on something you said, and we are wrapping up in 2 or 3 minutes, but it ties to the last question. When I leave here, I'm going back to the virtual National Association of Corporate Directors annual conference. And you've not just written about Weinstein, you've written about Starbucks and Amazon, you've written about Trump, you've written about pharmaceutical industry. And you mentioned a minute ago this idea that boardrooms now look at this as risk. What's extremely hopeful, having participated in the program yesterday, is they're actually saying boardrooms are now responsible for culture. That is a significant pivot because culture usually was handled by management. So I think positive, it's not just a risk story, it's also, do you know what the culture of the company is? Are you aware of it, and are you making sure it's the right culture? But leading to that, there's another company in the news, and this member of the audience is interested in your opinion as to whether it was right for the whistleblower at Facebook to turn over documents to the media. Should they have launched a lawsuit? But the Facebook story is a big story. It is about an employee sharing documents with a good purpose, and journalism is now wrestling with that. Could you close on what your observations are about the decision of the whistleblower and how this story may unfold?
I am so glad that that's the last question. Because the case we always want to make to people is that talking to a journalist, if you're doing it in the public service, is a really good thing to do. So when we get on the phone with people, they're often so nervous, or they won't answer the phone at all. Because what have we all been taught growing up? That being a tattletale is bad, that being a complainer is bad, that you're supposed to just sort of quiet down, and stay in your lane, and you're not supposed to necessarily speak out if you do something wrong. And even sitting here in this library, I always think about the Harry Potter books and the fact that Rita Skeeter, the journalist, is like one of the worst characters characters in that entire series. And it tortures me because I think to myself, we're taking the kids who love to read and we're showing them that this is what journalism is. That hurts my heart because there's something much more noble at hand. And when in sort of like those very private, hushed phone calls with sources, part of what we're trying to give people the courage to do is to really listen to their convictions and to understand that if they tell us a story about the Weinstein Company, or if they share documents from inside a company like Facebook, what they're doing is they're taking their pain and struggle that they feel over these things that are just not right. And they're putting them on the table for society to talk about. You know, they're essentially donating the knowledge and saying, I'm limited in what I can do if this remains secret. You, the journalist, are becoming essentially a safe conduit for me to get this stuff on the table for society to discuss. So as journalists, you know, Megan and I don't have a position on what should happen with Facebook. Should it be broken up? Should it be regulated? You know, what should the rules be, et cetera, et cetera. But I think our position is that we need to understand this company that's shaping all of our lives, that's caused major consequences for society, and that this whistleblower and people like her have given us the tools with which to actually have a fact-based debate that can really inform our decisions and opinions on what's going on. And so I feel like for our whole careers, we will be on that quest to show that telling the truth can be a really brave and uplifting and noble thing to do.
Wonderful way to end our panel. Thank you very much, Jodi. Thank you very much, Megan.
I just want to say quickly thank you again to both of you and to Joan. There are signed copies of the book over there on the right-hand side if you guys want to pick up your signed copy. And then on the back of these little pamphlets is a cute little QR code if you would like to make a donation to the library. It is donations from people like you that help us have programs like this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Excellent.
Thanks.